None of the leaders at that summer's G8 summit wanted Iran to become a nuclear power, but most were worried that the US might use force to stop them.
The international community must come together to make it very clear to Iran that we will not tolerate the construction of a nuclear weapon. Iran would be dangerous.
Fundamentally, both the president and the vice president felt we were going to have to overthrow the regime. Iran, under the control of the Islamic Revolution, was never going to be a rational partner, and that the ultimate way to stop Iran from pursuing nuclear weapons or supporting international terrorism was to change the regime in Tehran.
The Bush administration didn't openly threaten to strike Iran, but they did have an agreed phrase for it.
All options are obviously on the table, as the president has said repeatedly.
Senator, I just have to repeat, the president never takes any option off the table, and he shouldn't. Be very clear, the president of the United States doesn't take any options off the table.
For our part, the United States is keeping all options on the table.
And as the president has said, all options are on the table.
Die Erfahrung mit dem Krieg im Irak und die Sorge war groß, dass nach dem Irak sozusagen der Iran die nächste Stufe sein würde.
Yoska called me and said, look, we mustn't allow the Western allies to be split again in respect of Iran.
Es gab zwei Dinge. Erstens, mein Eindruck war, Jack Straw wollte auf jeden Fall einen zweiten Irak vermeiden. Und zweitens, die Amerikaner mit ins Boot zu holen, war Großbritannien unverzichtbar.
He said, why don't you and I get a deal from the Iranians where in return for lifting of sanctions, we get copper-bottomed guarantees, internationally verified, that they're not pursuing a nuclear weapons program. And I said I thought it was a very good idea. Obviously, I talked to the Prime Minister about it, and he endorsed it. And so that's how the E3 process began.
The E3, or EU3, the foreign ministers of the UK, France and Germany, had set themselves a difficult task.
We went to Tehran to get them to agree to stop enrichment and everything to do with enrichment. They should stop it forever. So we wanted to get them into that by getting them to agree to a suspension, to a halt.
My working assumption was that they would not have agreed to the meeting unless they had something to give us. Why would they?
Dr. Hassan Rouhani, who led the Iranian delegation, was the national security advisor to the supreme leader. When the meeting began, he played his strongest card: Iran's right to enrich uranium under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT.
جمهوری اسلامی ایران همانند سایر کشورهایی که امضا کننده NPT هستند باید به همه حقوق قانونی خودش در زمینه صلح‌آمیز و فعالیت‌های هسته‌ای صلح‌آمیز برسه.
The Europeans replied that Iran had violated its treaty obligations and should suspend its enrichment program. Iran had smuggled centrifuges to enrich uranium and then hid them from international inspectors.
We are talking about a lack of trust, and you are responsible for that.
Rouhani said that they would agree to not putting radioactive material into the centrifuges.
Which would mean that Iran was not enriching, and so that would mean suspension of enrichment.
Pour nous, c'était une définition beaucoup trop étroite des activités liées à l'enrichissement, puisque c'est tout ça ce que nous cherchions à suspendre. Et on a vu tout de suite qu'il y avait là un problème.
The problem with Iran's definition of suspension was that it would allow them to build more centrifuges and master the skills needed to run them.
We didn't want to allow a situation where all this equipment was kind of primed, ready to go, but all they agreed to do was not to press the button. So that was the argument, and it was a really big argument.
For 2 hours, the Iranians stood firm. Then Rouhani gambled that the Europeans would not want to go home empty-handed and would settle for Iran's narrow definition of suspension.
Rouhani looked at his watch and said, oh, it's time for us to go and report to the president. And then something extraordinary happened, quite unscripted.
And Yoshka just banged the table and said, look, there's no point us going to see the president or talking to the press. We've not agreed anything.
We would be fools. I mean, to sit there in a press conference, be polite, and nobody had an interest, I mean, to create bad feelings with our oaths.
And Rouhani said, well, this is as much as we can agree to. And Yoshik said, well, in that case, we might as well go and catch our planes.
You could see these guys thinking, God, that wasn't in our script.
There was almost a total failure and breakout. We decided, both sides, I think, decided to call a break and discuss it.
The Iranian negotiator needed instructions from the supreme leader and the president.
And Rouhani got out his mobile.
اونها میگفتن که کلیه فعالیت هایی که به نحو مرتبط هست به این مسئله باید تعلیق بشه. ما اینو قبول نداشتیم. خب مسئله مشکل شد.
He was speaking very quietly, but it was clearly quite an intense conversation that Rouhani was having.
It was quite extraordinary. So we're sort of hanging around.
Rouhani's consultations with President Khatami lasted over an hour. They knew that if the Europeans went home now, President Bush might act.
گفتم خب حالا که شما نمیتونیم به توافق برسیم این رو واگذار کنیم به تفسیری که آژانس از این مسئله میده.
When Iran agreed that the International Atomic Energy Agency could set the terms of suspension, it seemed that they had caved in to Europe's demand. Now the Europeans were happy to meet the president.
We were not bad in poker game too, in the diplomatic poker game. I mean, the European part.
But the Iranians thought they had the ace up their sleeve. They had already asked the IAEA director, Mohammad El-Baradei, how he would define suspension.
Dr. El-Baradei had visited the day before, and they discussed the meaning of suspension. Dr. Rouhani believed that El-Baradei had considered suspension to be basically not feeding uranium into the centrifuges.
متاسفانه آقای البرادعی علیرغم قولی که یعنی علیرغم حرفی که زده بود و علیرغم معیارهایی که بود یک جور دیگری تعلیق رو مطرح کردن که به نظر ما امر بسیار خلاف اخلاقی بود.
The IAEA defined suspension as Europe wanted. And 4 months later, they reported that Iran had been hiding a new, advanced centrifuge. Iran had expected agreement with Europe would bring economic rewards. None came. Later that year, Iran went to the polls to elect a new parliament. The clerics and the supreme leader disqualified most of the candidates who favored negotiations with the West. The new parliament was dominated by hardliners. This tough line was reinforced by the Supreme Leader's new appointment to the National Security Council, Ali Larijani.
برداشت یه عده مثل ماها این بود که این در واقع نوید یه قالیچه‌ای داره میده که ما روش بشینیم، یه هیچ وقت قصد بافتنش وجود نداره و فقط از رنگارنگی این قالیچه و خوش رنگ و آب بودنش داره برای ما توصیف میکنن. خب البته نظرات دیگر این بود